we go. All right, good evening, everyone. Great to see you all. I'm Caroline Angel Burke. I'm the Vice President for Education, Visitor Experience, and Collections here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. Welcome to our full-sized replica of the U.S. Senate chamber. As you are perhaps experiencing, this room is a powerful space. To over 20,000 students who visit us each year, this room transforms them into senators for the day, challenging them to build, debate, and vote on legislation that tackles some of our nation's most intractable public policy issues. To our visitors, this room gives each an opportunity to learn more about the rich history and current practices of one of our democracy's most important institutions. To those who attend our public programs, like yourselves, this chamber provides a space that reminds us that finding common ground is both critical and possible, no matter what the challenge, and that civil and respectful conversation, despite our differences, leads to lasting change. Tonight, we're gathered here to reflect on another truth that this room symbolizes, that there have been many moments in our nation's history when the people sitting in these chairs have been compelled to act by those that they represent. In this case, we are, of course, referring to the long and difficult history of women's suffrage. As many of you here tonight recognize, it often takes extraordinary efforts from innumerable people to make changes occur, and a very long time to see the impacts of that work. The movement to pass the amendment that would secure the right to vote for all women is, of course, not measured in years, maybe not even decades, but rather in generations. But don't worry, we didn't attempt to cram the full history of women's suffrage into one program. While we would be up for trying to make a 16-hour documentary, I'm sure you would not necessarily want to sit through that here this evening. But we have focused our program instead on the last decade prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we blend our storytelling between the evocative images, footage, and music of the era with the words that capture the history of these critical events. Tonight, in addition to this program's premiere, we are honored to be joined in conversation with some of the scholars and writers we know who know the women's suffrage movement best, including our project scholar and advisor, Dr. Roberta Wallens from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's going to be joined by Dr. Paula Austin and Dr. Susan Ware for a lively conversation about the mixed legacy of the 19th Amendment. We'll have a chance to get to know all three panelists a bit more later in the program. I'd also like to take this opportunity before we get started to offer our deepest thanks to some of the people and organizations who really made it possible to create this program. Firstly, to the Barbara Lee Foundation and Mass Humanities, the Institute is deeply grateful to both organizations for sponsoring this important work. We are thrilled that the program will be one that we feature here at the Institute from now until June, and will live on as part of our regular program rotation for thousands of visitors to enjoy. Voting as a fundamental right in our democracy is a theme that we will carry through this entire year. I think there's an election coming up, maybe? And having a historic context in which to discuss current issues of voter registration, suppression, and representation is critical. So again, we thank both Barbara Lee Foundation and Mass Humanities for helping us to realize this vision. I'd also like to recognize and thank our media development partners, Richard Lewis Media Group, or RLMG. We have had the great fortune to work with RLMG since the Kennedy Institute's inception, and they've developed much of the media that you enjoy in our surround exhibits, orientation theater, and many of our other media-rich chamber programs, including all three of our great Senate debates. Their team never fails to amaze us by weaving together images, film footage, sound, and transporting us to another time and place, and does so as true collaborators. So to Jill, Evelyn, Sean, and Greg, and the whole RLMG team, thanks again for making another fantastic program. To our neighbors and friends at the Commonwealth Museum and Archives, Stephen Kenny and Michael Como and team, we thank you for sharing your suffragette stories and that you're welcome to view on our lobby and the surround that you probably saw as you made your way in. As partners in Women's Suffrage 100 Mass Coalition, we are thrilled to be joining together to tell this important story. Last, but certainly not least, I'd like to recognize our fantastic Kennedy Institute team who conceived of, researched, wrote, and cast this production. Thanks to Lauren Scribby, Miles Halpin, and Allison Kaminsky on our public programs team who helped produce and promote the evening. To Mitch Carolyn and Katie LeClaire, who created the digital exhibit about women's suffrage in Massachusetts, thank you for your creative work. Thanks to Nate Gundy, who worked with our staff in casting and performance. And last but not least, kudos to Lou Rocco, who grant wrote and authored this wonderful program. It's been a pleasure to see how his very hard work at developing has developed into something I think truly extraordinary. So that being said, it is time to get this program started. As a heads up, the lights are going to dim for most of the duration of the program, so please watch your step if you feel that you need to exit during the run of the Citizen Senate, Women's Fight for Suffrage.
The United States Senate has been called a place for sober second thought, a special forum where the passions of the people could be checked by debate and deliberation. The upper chamber of Congress, the Senate was designed to be more removed from the nation's people than the House of Representatives, to investigate and dissect the issues facing the nation, no matter how long it took. But at key moments in our history, the people of the United States have compelled the Senate to act. This is the story of the final decade of women's fight for suffrage, the right to vote. A fight which spanned several generations. It is a story of patience and persistence in the face of ignorance, opposition, setbacks, and defeats. A story of how moderate and radical voices worked to achieve a common goal. And a story of a movement fighting for equality, yet failing to treat all of its members equally. On March 3, 1913, thousands of women from across the country took to the streets of Washington, D.C. to demand the right to vote. Building on the momentum generated by suffrage campaign victories in Western states, the Women's Suffrage Parade was designed to grab the nation's attention and to put President-elect Woodrow Wilson on notice. Planned by Alice Paul of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the march demonstrated the growing strength of the suffrage movement. But it also demonstrated an underlying inequality. The march was racially segregated, relegating African American leaders such as Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell to the back of the procession despite their strong leadership in the movement. Crowds of onlookers blocked and in some cases assaulted the marchers, sending over 100 women to the hospital, while police officers stood idly by. The treatment of the suffragists attracted national sympathy, triggering Part 2 of Alice Paul's plan, the Siege of the Senate. Hundreds of women flooded the Capitol building to hand-deliver petitions to their senators. The petitions carried the signatures of tens of thousands of women demanding the vote. Senators had to take the demands of their constituents seriously. The recently ratified 17th Amendment meant that senators were now directly elected by the people instead of being appointed by state legislatures. Adding to this political pressure, women also testified directly before the Senate. This included Belle La Follette, writer, activist, lawyer, and wife of Senator Robert La Follette. In her testimony, she implored senators to consider how American home life and society would benefit from women's direct participation in government.
In the struggle for equal suffrage, the real question is not whether all women are asking for the vote, but whether it is in the interest of the home, of society, of government, that the people as a whole shall be respected in making the laws that govern them as a whole. It is a question of democracy. My basic reason for believing in equal suffrage is that it will make better homes. The home is the basis of society. Government exists for society. Home, society, government are best where men and women have the widest range of common interests, where they share with each other the solution of their common problems. And when it comes to national affairs, I cannot think of a single important question in the last 25 years in which women have not been equally concerned with men. Quite naturally, they have directed their indirect influence through their various organizations to the Pure Food Law, to the conservation of our national forests, to the child labor legislation. This shows how women's direct influence in legislation would supplement the work of men and make our government more regardful of the general human welfare. Participation in government is a question of patriotism, love of our community, loyalty to our state, and devotion to our nation. You know how Lincoln defined government at Gettysburg: of the people, by the people, for the people. Are not women people? Government is not a man's problem, nor a woman's problem alone. It is their mutual problem. And it is only when women are given their share of responsibility in the solution of public questions that the affairs of government will be brought into the home for discussion. Not until then will government become a familiar subject, interwoven into the family life and understood as it must be if democracy in its best form is to endure.
The pressure generated by the siege of the Senate eventually compelled senators to hold a vote on the women's suffrage constitutional amendment for the first time in 27 years. The Susan B. Anthony Amendment, as it was known, was easily defeated, but the fact that suffragists were able to force a vote on it in the first place demonstrated the growing power of their movement. Still, the road ahead would bring new challenges. Alice Paul and the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or the National, clashed over differences on strategy. While Paul believed that suffragists should place all of their energy into securing suffrage through the Anthony Amendment, the National's leaders believed that such an approach was premature and politically risky. Amending the Constitution requires approval by 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as 3/4 of all states. Given that only 9 states had granted women full suffrage by 1914, the Nationals' leaders believed that women simply didn't have the political leverage to pass a constitutional amendment. There was a difference over tactics as well. Paul, who had spent over 2 years working with militant suffragettes in Great Britain, was not afraid to criticize those in power and use dramatic gestures to make national headlines. The National preferred a quieter, more diplomatic approach and sought to court both Republicans and Democrats to support the cause. These differences eventually led Paul and the National to part ways. This schism helped lead to a major overhaul in the National. In December 1915, Carrie Chapman Catt, a 25-year veteran of the suffrage movement, was chosen to lead the organization. Catt's talents as an organizer helped resuscitate the ailing National and would prove vitally important to the ultimate success of the movement. In September 1916, she debuted a new winning plan designed to increase women's political clout, exert more pressure on Congress, and direct more of the National's resources toward securing passage of the Anthony Amendment, as Alice Paul had advocated. After years of persistent lobbying, Catt and other National leaders also secured the support of President Woodrow Wilson. He proved a valuable ally, lobbying his fellow Democrats in Congress. Meanwhile, Paul and her allies founded the National Woman's Party, a smaller, more confrontational organization which would rival and challenge the larger, more mainstream National. Despite their rivalry, the differing approaches taken by both organizations would exert greater pressure on the government than either could do alone. While Cat and the National allied themselves with President Wilson, Paul and the Woman's Party confronted him directly. Beginning in 1917, its members became the first group in American history to picket directly outside of the White House. The picketers criticized President Wilson for his hypocrisy in calling for self-determination around the world, while women in the United States went without that very right. The president and onlookers initially tolerated these protests, but the response changed drastically following America's entry into World War I in April 1917. Picketers faced harassment just as they did during the 1913 march, but this time the police played a very different role. They arrested hundreds of picketers, including Paul herself, and sent them to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. Some jailed suffragists went on hunger strikes and were force-fed by prison authorities. The treatment of the imprisoned suffragists generated sympathy for the movement, including from senators who visited Occoquan and witnessed the conditions firsthand. With no end to the pickets or the negative publicity in sight, all prisoners were unconditionally released in late November of 1917. Women's role during World War I also advanced the cause. With men shipping off to Europe, women successfully stepped into their places. On factory floors, farms, and government offices, women demonstrated their abilities and commitment to the war effort on the home front. As nurses, ambulance drivers, clerks, and switchboard operators, they demonstrated their bravery on the front lines in Europe. It was in this environment that Cat made the case that women's suffrage was a pivotal war measure.
Whoever denies that women's suffrage is not only an appropriate subject for discussion at this time, but an imperative war measure, is ignorant of the causes which led to the war and the aims for which we are fighting in the war. There are but two sources from which historians can draw the causes which led to the declaration of war. One is the war address made by the President to Congress, and the other is the 100 speeches made by the House and Senate in response to that address. The kernel of the President's speech was a single sentence, an aphorism destined to be immortal. We shall fight to make the world safe for democracy. Nearly every speech by senator and representative reiterated the same spirit and hope. But what is the democracy for which we are fighting and for which we offer our manpower, our woman power, our all? Government of the world by consent of the individual nations. Government of the nations by consent of the individual people. These are our war aims, our ideals. And all these aims call for votes. There can be no self-determination of the people as to their own form of government without votes. Who is to cast them? The landed aristocracy? The nobility? A few men? Or the people? Our country professes to mean the people. But does it? Is it sincere? Is our own nation governed by consent of the people? No. The world expects America to live up to her ideals, to live up to the war aims she has set for herself. The president wants the federal suffrage amendment to pass. Tell your senators that you will back them if they choose to back the president and the allies on this question. They want to hear that you are willing to keep step in time with democracy permeating the world and giving us new hope for the future and the belief that with the people, men and women, behind a world movement, This may be made the last war.
Momentum for the movement was gathering. The pickets, women's support for the war effort, and a slew of new states extending suffrage to women led to a breakthrough in Washington. The House of Representatives passed the Anthony Amendment for the first time on January 10, 1918. The suffragists now turned their attention to the Senate. The movement had gained many allies in the chamber, but a potent minority of Northeastern Republicans and Southern Democrats remained opposed. This group, known among suffragists as the Unholy Alliance, had been able to block the amendment for years. Suffragists redoubled their efforts to compel senators to vote, blocking the entrance to the Senate office building with banners and disrupting traffic with marches in the streets. Pressure from the suffragists and allies like President Wilson eventually led to a vote. On October 1, 1918, the Senate voted 53 to 31 in favor of the amendment, 2 votes shy of the 2/3 majority required by the Constitution. This loss motivated suffragists to focus their energy on the upcoming November elections. Their efforts helped defeat key opposition senators, greatly increasing the chances that the amendment would pass when the new session of Congress began in the spring. Nevertheless, white women in the suffrage movement remained concerned about the issue of race undermining the cause. In March 1919, the Nationals leaders sent a letter to Mary Church Terrell asking her to persuade the Northeastern Federation of Colored Women's Clubs to withdraw their request for membership. Organization leaders feared that accepting the request would jeopardize their efforts to convince white women in the South to support the amendment. Terrell stood her ground and refused the Nationals' request. Back in the Senate, as another vote on the Anthony Amendment approached in June, opponents took to the Senate floor to make their case, including Senator William Borah of Idaho.
I am not opposed to women's suffrage. It has prevailed in my state for over 20 years. And after these years of observation, I am still a believer in such suffrage. But while I have always been a believer and an advocate of suffrage, I have always believed that the matter should be settled by the action of the respective states. The right of a state to control its own local affairs and manage its own concerns is indispensable to the preservation of the federal union. It is because this amendment does violence to that principle that I am going to cast my vote against it. To the question of policy, does anybody propose that this amendment is anything but a white amendment? Let me ask my friends, when this guarantee is written into the Constitution, which gives Negro women the right to vote in the South, and you the power to see that that provision is carried out, do the men on this side of the chamber propose to see that that is done? Do you propose to put the South under federal control as to elections? I should like to have somebody tell me whether or not this which we are writing into the Constitution is not a solemn lie. Nobody intends that the Negro women of the South shall vote. Neither upon my side nor your side do you expect this guarantee to be anything but a dead letter when it is passed. I come back to the point of local self-government. I would not, for any ordinary cause, put anything in the way of women to vote, but this principle is fundamental. Without its preservation, the right to vote in time will be fruitless. Without the principle of local self-government, democracy is a sham.
wrongs in need of righting should be righted right away. The principle of justice should be honored every day. The right should never linger for a moment by the way, as truth goes marching on.
Despite the opposition of senators like Bora, victory was finally at hand. On June 4th, 1919, after 70 years of lobbying, picketing, and pressure by the women of the suffrage movement, the Senate passed the Anthony Amendment by a vote of 56 to 25. The amendment was then sent to the states for ratification. Following a razor-thin vote in August 1920, Tennessee became the 36th and final state necessary to make the 19th Amendment the law of the land.
Response to her demand as truth goes marching on. Sing.
As remarkable a victory as the 19th Amendment was for American women, in practice its guarantees did not apply equally to all. Almost as soon as the 19th Amendment was ratified, states throughout the South began placing obstacles in front of women of color seeking to vote. These women appealed to Congress and their white sisters for help, but Congress failed to provide relief and white women refused to provide assistance. It would take another 45 years of courageous and persistent effort until women of color truly won access to the ballot box through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The final decade of the suffrage movement is notable for its achievements and its failures. Perseverance, sacrifice, brilliant organization, and profound physical bravery secured a radical change to the United States Constitution. At the same time, bigotry and a failure of solidarity led the movement to betray some of its most committed members and align itself with a racist power structure. This stunning, flawed fight for the right to vote and the struggles that would follow it teach a lesson both daunting and inspiring: that the work of expanding, protecting, and preserving the blessings of democracy requires a renewed commitment from each generation and is never finished.
Right and justice as truth goes marching on.
As we do a little set change for our discussion, let's give another hand to our amazing actors. They were Lindsay Eagle, Katie Grindland, and Regine Vidal. We are so lucky at the Institute that many of our education staff, such as Lindsay and Katie, are also accomplished actors, as well as educators. I'd also like to especially thank Regine for joining us tonight to play Senator William Bora. Now I have the pleasure of introducing Roberta Wallens. Dr. Wallens is a professor and former chair of the History Department at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Her research is on American women's social and political movements, women's education, and women in religion during the Progressive Era. She is the author of numerous articles and chapters on American women educators, including those teaching abroad in Japan, India, and Ottoman Turkey. Her most recent work is as author and co-editor of a forthcoming book, Crossing Boundaries: Personal Encounters in East Asia and Beyond. Dr. Wallens has been our humanities scholar advisor on this project, and we're absolutely thrilled she's here this evening to chair this discussion. Now, following this panel discussion, we'll have a chance to take some questions from the audience. So, get your questions ready. Dr. Wallens?
Thank you. So I'd like to also welcome everybody for coming tonight for the launch of this project of the EMKI celebration of the 100th anniversary of the suffrage amendment. I just have to say it's somewhat of an auspicious day to be in the Senate chamber, given the issues of our national importance that are being conducted right now, even as we speak. It's also the day after we celebrated the life of Martin Luther King, where we remember Dr. King for his commitment to civil rights and the importance of activism in service to equality and to justice, and the urgency of action in the face of stagnation and complacency. As we have just witnessed, 100 years ago, women of America achieved the right to vote after decades of bravery and commitment on the part of individuals who would defy the laws and the patriarchal systems of power under which they had been raised. This year we celebrate their tenacity, their belief in the meaning of citizenship, and the constitutional amendment they fought so hard to attain. The vote did not change racism and sexism in our culture, but it did provide the means to change that equation. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists, two outstanding scholars of the history of suffrage and the long fight for equal rights. Table here to lean on first. I'd like to introduce Susan Ware to my far left. Susan Ware serves as the Honorary Women's Suffrage Centennial Historian at the Schlesinger Library, Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and the General Editor of the Biographical Dictionary, American National Biography. Her most recent book, Why They Marched, Untold Stories of the Women Who Fought for the Right to Vote, was published by Harvard University Press in May of 2019, a brand new work. This summer, the Library of America will bring out her edited anthology, American Women's Suffrage, Voices from the Long Struggle for the Vote, 1776 to 1965. She also served as an historical consultant for the forthcoming American Experience documentary, The Vote. Welcome, Susan. I'd also like to now introduce Paula Austin. Paula is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at BU, our neighbor. She's the author of the recent released Coming of Age in Jim Crow, D.C., Navigating the Politics of Everyday Life. She writes and teaches about Black visual culture, African American women and civil rights histories, and facilitates faculty and professional development on equity, diversity, and inclusion. Welcome. So we have many things that we would like to discuss today, and I'd like to turn the questions over to the two of you to respond to some topics that we've developed along the way. We've come to, we've sort of tried to organize the discussion around some fruitful topics, and each one of our panelists will talk about them a bit. When they have presented their thoughts, as Carolyn mentioned, we'll be able to open this up to questions and answers from the audience, so have some questions in mind. We'll be happy to do that. And in terms of just the structure of it, we have 10 minutes per topic and 5 minutes per panelist to kind of discuss inside that topic. So we have, never enough time to talk about big and meaningful and important issues. So I'd like to start off with both of you to respond to the video that we just saw and the issues it brought up for you individually.
Okay, I'll go first. I think for me, it was especially powerful to see women acting as constituents and petitioners and protesters and picketers. In other words, we got to see in that video women acting as political actors, claiming their rights. And to me, that is a very powerful image that I keep with me and think about as I think about the mobilizations of women that have happened in the 100 years since. I think another takeaway point from me from watching that and also thinking about the Senate and being in this amazing room, I just wanted to be here. That's why I said I'd be on this panel, is how hard it is to amend the Constitution. and how hard it is to amend the Constitution, and the difficulty it took to get it through the Senate and then to get it through 36 states for ratification. And I think that we really need to remember that and realize how much hard work it took and what an accomplishment it was. I think my third takeaway from the video was a phrase from the end about how the women's suffrage movement was a stunning, flawed fight. And I think that juxtaposition of democracy and discrimination and against African American women and not fully welcoming them into the movement is a very important issue for us to grapple with, and it's one that Paula and I will be talking about in the next segment.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this, and it's nice to see everyone. So I, again, I want to build on what Susan said. I really appreciated the nuances of the movement. It's sort of the last decade in the movement for the amendment, but certainly not the last decade in the movement for the expansion of voting rights in the US, as we know. But I really appreciated the nuances of the difficulty of coalition building in social movements. I thought the video did that really well. And just a note about, it was mentioned that Wells and Terrell were not invited to march as part of it, but the story goes, and probably Susan can speak to this better than me, but Wells actually does indeed march with the Illinois delegation. She sort of sneaks in, I think is the story that's told, although you probably have a better telling of that. And Terrell did too. So, and they actually, sort of insisted on their participation, equal participation. And of course, Wells had organized kind of the only Black women's suffrage organization that is exclusively about suffrage, because most of Black women's organizations at the time were kind of multi-issue. And so the one that she's working on in Chicago is actually suffrage focused. But the other thing I want to say that I actually didn't pay attention to the first time I saw the video and read the speeches, because I hadn't heard the speeches performed before, was Bora, who I was sort of like, and Lou knows this, I was like, well, why'd you include him? Why is he getting to say something? And you don't have Terrell or Wells. But I actually was like, oh yeah, no, he was right. He makes a really excellent point, not just specifically about the 19th Amendment, but about enforcing amendments generally. And so I kind of appreciated Bora this time in a way that I didn't watching the video before.
I just wanted to add, just to compare to follow up on what Susan was saying about how it's difficult to pass an amendment. And just by comparison, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced into Congress in 1923, never passed until 1972, and then failed after a 7-year trial for ratification and then an extension of more years, and finally didn't make it at all. So I think the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment points out to how effective the suffrage movement was at that moment in time.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of parallels between suffrage and the ERA, and we all know ERA is a story without an ending, so maybe we will be able to draw those comparisons the next time we meet.
Hope so.
And Virginia just ratified it. Will it be added is the question.
Yeah, we'll see, right. So just moving on to our next topic, one of the dominant issues of the day since ratification has been the questions of race, classism, xenophobia, both with regard to voting per se and in the context of the larger history of the civil rights movement. And our two panelists, too, would like to talk a little bit about the issues that have just come up on race, class, and xenophobia, which was an important element of public sentiment in the 1920s.
Okay. Well, so I appreciated that the video spoke specifically about a sort of exclusionary policy, racial exclusionary policy, and concerns about getting support. And it's a divide that happens early on in the suffrage movement. And a local, Lucy Stone is sort of a local hero in that she actually breaks with Stanton and Anthony around their lack of support for the 15th Amendment early on. And I think, I think what I appreciated about that struggle is the relationship between race, class, and an anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, I think, it's not ideal. We don't want to think about the movement as this exclusionary thing, but the importance of it, I think, can't be overemphasized. Primarily in thinking about the difference between black women's activism up until that point, and from abolitionism and then forward, as being kind of a multi-issue focused one, and one that was really about expanding human rights in a lot of different ways, and the kind of narrowing of what becomes the suffrage movement of a white women's movement. And I think the thing that is really interesting to me, the kind of flip side of that is about organizing, is about the ways in which suffrage leaders, who were predominantly white and middle class, actually use their race and class privilege to do some very sort of tactical things that I think we think about in a very particular way right now about the movement. I mean, to your point about the pickets and about their way in which those women can really take advantage of race and class privilege to use public space at that particular moment, that I think is brand new and is an important piece of the movement. So their sort of racism and classism, xenophobia also has a flip side in thinking about the ways in which they mobilize their own class privilege and race privilege to do particular things in the movement at that moment.
Well, I think one of the challenges that is faced when we are thinking about how to mark the centennial of the suffrage movement is how to deal with the issue of racism in the movement. And I have been pleased is not quite the right word, but I think it's been a positive development how much the issue of racism has been foregrounded in the discussions. And I think this says something about where we are in our society today, that it's a development where people are willing to confront this. And I think one reason why it's so important to talk about both racism in the movement and the role of African American women in the movement is if we succumb to this kind of knee-jerk, they're all just upper middle class white women asking for the vote for themselves. Who cares? Why does it matter? Let's move on to more important things. If you do that and you dismiss the whole women's suffrage struggle, you have marginalized yet again the African American women who were such a central part of it. And so to me, as part of thinking about reclaiming the passion and the power and the politics of this movement, you have to do it by including both white women and African American women. And as Paula alluded to, when we're drawing the parallels between political mobilization of women back then and what we're doing now, it is the vision of African American women, which was never just about their sex. It included race and class. This intersectional vision is one that resonates so much better with the way that current feminists are approaching social change. And so to me, it's a very important recovery and also sort of bringing it into the story. And that's why I was so glad to see it well done in the video, and that people are talking about this in a way that is not just they're digging down more deeply, and I think that's a very positive development.
Right, it's not just a sidebar.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to add one aspect to the movement, too, that sometimes gets overlooked, and that's kind of the xenophobia side of it, is that there was, as there was fear among the white women leaders about what would happen in the South, and a fear of alienating white women in the South who might support the movement, there was also a fear among Northeastern women who were feeling humiliated and upset about the fact that immigrant men could vote and they couldn't, and supported the movement out of a feeling of their own exclusion from a voting privilege that was extended to people for whom they didn't have a lot of respect. You know, people who were immigrants, they didn't speak English, they were not Protestant, they were, for a variety of reasons. And I think in that respect too, the immigrant women who were interested in trying to work with the larger organizations for suffrage also were marginalized and don't end up in the history book. They don't end up in the story. So I don't want to exclude them either.
And I'll add that the context of a kind of national anti-immigrant sentiment is an important one. So it isn't just that those suffrage ladies are xenophobic. It's that the country,
whole country,
is essentially,
the whole country had a problem with immigrants, as we do now. So moving on to our next topic, one of the differences that separated the suffrage organizations was over what tactics could be used. I think that comes out really interestingly in the video, although there's always more to say about that. And so the tactics, the questions had to do with what would best serve the goals of equality. And both of our panelists have some interesting ways to talk about that.
Well, I think as I went back and researched the suffrage movement for my recent book, I began to have a much deeper appreciation for the role of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the Carrie Chapman Cats, the work within the system, women who were there lobbying day after day at the Capitol and organizing in their states. And they were really doing some of the hard everyday work of trying to change people's minds. And yet there is something so compelling and appealing about thinking, would I have been a picketer? Would I have been outside the White House? Would I have been willing to go to jail? And so we admire the commitment, the willingness to literally put their lives on the line of those militant women who were not all just young. They were a wide range of ages. And I think that, like many social movements, the suffrage movement shows us that you often need both kinds of political advocacy and action, and that it's also kind of good for both of them to say, oh, well, we're not like them, and oh, no, we're not like those stodgy, our mothers over there. And they can kind of play off each other in ways. I think the other thing that I noticed as I looked at the large history of suffrage is the different strategy about whether you go state by state or whether you go for a federal amendment. And I think for many years, working for state by state change was actually a very productive way to go. Certainly it produced the major victories in the West. And yet at a certain point, and it happens in the teens where the video was talking about, I think the balance shifts to seeing a need for a federal amendment, and that this is where all the force has to be placed in order to try and make that happen, both by the militants and by Carrie Chapman Catt and her suffragists. So I think that's another one of those thinking about strategy and tactics. And I think the third thing is just the key importance of public spectacle and taking it to the streets. The suffrage march in 1913. And it reminds me of a phrase that many of you are familiar with. You probably have T-shirts or mugs with it, but it's from my friend Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and it's, well-behaved women seldom make history.
If I could just piggyback on that for a second about tactics and strategy, I just want to kind of point out that the fact that these organizations were divided and one side of it really worked on state by state suffrage, achievements, and the other side was working for the federal amendment, created a nationwide organization that when it came time for the states to ratify the amendment, the states were organized. Yeah. And it was, every state had its own organization that had been on the ground for a long time, and it was a matter of just getting those through, which also is a difference with the Equal Rights Amendment, which never had a state-by-state strong organization, so that the ratification process was like starting from scratch, as opposed to having a deep organization already developed in there. So I think, the differences in their tactics ended up being really beneficial when it came time for ratification. Go ahead.
I just want to give a little shout out to a friend of mine, Lauren Santangelo, who just published a book about exactly this, the kind of the state work that happens in New York. Her book is called Suffrage in the City, and she spends a lot of time, she has great stories in that book about the use of public space, about women going into, sort of taking advantage of race and class privilege to go into public spaces, male-only spaces, to really drum up support and actually make a lot of people mad at them. Wall Street baseball games, where they were like, well, the baseball players should be wearing sandwich boards about suffrage, and they were all like, we can't wear sandwich boards and play baseball. But I want to add too that that the importance of the federal amendment was something that African American women really understood, but the piece about enforcement was going to be important, which is why when I heard Bora again, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Of course, because there was already the 15th Amendment, and there were already immediately obstacles in place that included things like voting, registering to vote, literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses. And I think one of the interesting things when we think about Henry Cabot Lodge, whose name was up there as an opposer. One of the interesting things is that many of those sort of things that were sort of voter suppression techniques at the time were modeled on some Massachusetts voter suppression techniques. I mean, Alabama sort of models its imposition at the turn of the last century of literacy tests and grandfather clauses on the Massachusetts voter registration practices.
I know. So moving into our next topic that we wanted to discuss, in the end, the question always arises regarding the relationship of political change to cultural change. Does cultural change follow political change, or does cultural change have to be the precursor to political change? And I want to bring that up to our two panelists. It's not an easy question, and it depends a lot on the issue, but let's give it a shot.
Well, obviously, political change and cultural change are always interrelated. But what I would say to answer that is just to remind us all that the struggle for the vote was never just about voting. It was really about women's roles in the broader society. And if you think about how women's roles had changed over the span, the 7 decades, if you start it in 1848, historians like to start it a little bit further back, and maybe in the 1830s. But if you think about what American women's lives were like then, and then you fast forward to 1910, into the 19-teens, and you realize that there have been vast changes in women's lives in terms of their access to work and professions and education. Birth rate has declined, marriages are more companionate, all kinds of things have changed. And these, I think, help to explain why at this point in the 1910s that there is a sense that now is time for, it would be appropriate, well, I think it would have been appropriate before then, for women to have the vote. But even I have a hard time imagining women getting the vote in the 1830s and 40s. By the 1910s, it's not such a strange thing. But having said that, I would also remind us that any changes in gender roles, especially traditional roles, women's roles in the home, in the family, are incredibly scary to a lot of people. And part of the reason why the vote became such a hot button issue and why the opposition was so dynamic and so organized and really kept it from happening for so long was because people were really afraid. They were afraid of what these changes in women's lives might mean. Would they stop taking care of their children if they voted once a year? Not terribly likely, but people were concerned, and I'm sure this resonates for many people if you think about other moments in our history where political changes have then been seen through this lens of challenges to traditional women's roles. And I think that is one of the things that's going on in the suffrage movement.
I would say too that I think we know when something becomes an issue when it gets national coverage in a particular way, when sort of everybody is talking about it, even as a point of fear. So I think at the point that we get the ratification, we have had so much cultural change in terms of gender roles and women's roles in particular that it almost, of course we're having a national conversation about women's suffrage. And I'm thinking about all of the political activism that we might not think about as political activism that women, both white women and black women and women of other minoritized groups have been participating in sort of at their community level, at the church level, and all of this is also political action. And I think one of the things I'm interested in my own work is thinking about how do people engage in politics if they don't have access to the vote, right? Which is kind of how, and so I think there's a long history of women, all inclusive, being engaged politically at the community level, at the town level, at the city level, at the state level, that I think really undergirds, I don't know if that's the right word, but is underneath kind of what becomes the ratification.
Yeah, if I can just add a little bit to that too. The period moving, running up to the actual vote we kind of think of it as the progressive era, which was a period of extraordinary reform. And women were at the center of so much of the urban reform, of all kinds of reform, of child labor laws, of food and drug laws, of workmen's compensation laws, of sanitation law. There was so much that women were doing through the settlement houses and through various organizations. They were out in public, and they were lobbying their legislators for local legislative change and ways in which they wanted the urban environments to get more organized and more, just better for the people living in them. That it was not unusual to see women actively involved in legislative work. It's not like they walked out of their homes and into the vote. They were visible members of society activating legislative change and legal change for a while. So it's not like it wasn't a dramatic leap. In a way.
I'm thinking about the year before the ratification, the federal amendment of predominantly Catholic women in South End who are picketing. They're on strike. They're telephone operators and they're on strike and they're picketing the company. So that there are women involved in all kinds of labor activism. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we thought we might do to kind of wrap up our part of it and then open it up for discussion and questions from all of you was to kind of say, how do we want to mark the centennial? What do we want to take away? What exactly are we celebrating? And kind of where do we want to go from here?
You go first.
Well, I think, I've heard Treva Lindsay and Martha Jones, and Martha Jones actually has a new book about black women as sort of the vanguard of voting rights in a particular way that isn't out yet. And Treva Lindsay wrote about women in D.C. Who are suffrage activists, and I think both of them sort of, are concerned about the use of the word celebrate. And I think I join them in that. I think commemorate makes sense. And I think because I think in my research area, what I really look at is sort of the sort of growing obstacles and the continued obstacles to the franchise for African American women, for Chinese women, for indigenous women after the 19th Amendment, and sort of I think the trouble with looking at the ratification as kind of a necessarily kind of progressive line of the opening up of democracy obscures the fact that democracy is like, and actually the franchise in particular was always contested, right? It was always contested ground. It continues to be contested ground. We know that since the Shelby decision, there's so many things put into place around voter suppression, and a bunch of folks that are expanding the franchise for sure, but a bunch of states who are going in the opposite direction. And so I think commemorating, but as a reminder that the franchise has always been a place of contestation, and that we have to continue to fight for it.
Well, I think my perspective comes in part from having been a feminist women's historian for my entire career, which now stretches 4 decades or so, and to have a moment like 2020, and a centennial to mark, to me is a perfect excuse or opportunity to be able to acquaint a far broader range of people with some pretty basic history, women's history, political history that they don't really know about. So in a lot of ways, I'm a really happy camper, because what I love to do as a women's historian is share these stories with a broader public. And yet, I think we need to go beyond any kind of simple notion of celebration. And I think it behooves us to engage the underlying questions about citizenship and voting and gender and power. I think we also need to recognize that feminism is an ongoing struggle. I don't think I need to remind many people in this room about that, but that the women's suffrage movement is an important part of that story. And I think of suffragists as the voting rights activists of their day, and I hope that we can honor that commitment by continuing to fight those battles today, because as we know, there is still much work to be done. So that is how I approach the centennial.
On that note, I'd like to thank our panelists for a really wonderful discussion. And now it's your turn. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments you'd like to make, we'll be really happy to do them.
Hi, so you were commenting on the chicken or the egg question, the political or cultural change. And I know when I was observing the video, I hadn't really thought of the impacts of World War I and the role of women stepping into the workforce and what potential role that had in kind of like that little cultural change moment. I was curious if either of you could expand a bit upon that.
Well, I think World War I was a very important factor in all of this. I'm not sure we can point to any specific vote in the Senate that was changed by women's participation, and yet there was this general sense of seeing what women were able to do when they stepped up and the contributions that they made to the war effort while continuing their suffrage activism. I think it really was an important point to broaden the appeal of the movement. And also remember, mean, I thought the video was a little too kind to Woodrow Wilson. I'm not sure I would have called him a good friend or ally of the women's movement. But he did actually provide the suffrage movement with one of its best openings, which is the sense of World War I being a fight for democracy. And all the women have to do is say, yeah, that's what we're saying. So there, I think you really see it coming together.
And the arrests don't help. I mean, it did not help him that they were put in jail.
Right. I just wanted to add that it's sometimes constructed that World War I really was the reason that women got the vote, kind of forgetting the 70 years prior to that, leading up to the vote. So I don't want to. I think it's true that World War I probably was a great visual for Americans to see women actively involved in the war, but not to overcredit that moment for and not to diminish everything that came before. There's a question over here.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Ware, for your book. I was a member of the League of Women Voters for over 50 years, so I thought I knew a lot about suffragists, but I really didn't, and learned so much from your book, so thank you.
Thank you.
But one of the things that struck me in your book was the fact that there was no Facebook, there was no internet, and yet these women, so many of them in the last run-up to the final vote, traversed this country. They did all kinds of things, you know, from climbing mountains and putting flags up and riding horses. So I wonder if you could comment on really the impact today of what we do in terms of Facebook and internet and all the other media versus what these women had to go through to get their message out.
I guess I would answer that by reminding us how politically savvy these suffragists were. And they were using all the tools they had available to them. And when new tools would come along, like newsreels or newspapers or handing out leaflets or dropping them from airplanes and things like that, they were right on it and they knew how to do it. And I see a similar thing going on today as people learn to use and adapt for their purposes what they have out there to get the word out. And yet, I think we do need to give the suffragists credit once again for what they were able to accomplish in a world without Facebook and Twitter and things like that. And again, it just reminds me of how politically adept they were. And, you know, these women had often been in other social movements. They'd been running women's clubs. They'd been running their churches. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to get things done. And then they just turned their attention to suffrage. And I think that's a good model for us all to follow today.
There's some questions over here.
Hi. A couple of years ago, I was privileged to be able to go to a showing of the film Suffragette, put on by the National Commission for Women and Massachusetts Suffrage 100. And they had the director there. They decided to focus on a working class woman as part of this, part of the British suffrage story. Now, we tend to forget that women were always in the workforce. Poor women were always working. African American women were always working. Immigrant women, they were always in the workforce. And so that when we mentioned xenophobia and all of this concepts of classism, the other thing that happened shortly before all of this was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which was immigrant women and working women. So I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on the fact that, you know, the working women and how they were or were not able to participate.
I think that, you know, as we reclaim and widen our sense of who's involved in the suffrage movement, including the roles of working class women, is very important. And one of the things that you see is these women, especially if they were involved in the labor movement, they were used to picketing and being in the streets, building that public spectacle, and they're very important part of that. And I think they also bring a broader vision because they realize that many of their problems are not just because they're women, it's because they are poor. And so they have that broader vision. And yet, what I was really struck by when I looked at some of the working class women like Rose Schneiderman is that they also really strongly believed in the vote. And they felt it was very important for them as working women to have the vote. And I see this as a way of, again, expanding our sense of who was involved in this movement. And it's not accurate to think it's only white middle-class women.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the multi-issue organizing piece is so important. And for poor and working class women, for African American women, that their belief in the vote is not singular. That it really is part of a much larger kind of platform for an expansion of rights generally, of citizenship rights.
We have a question up here in the balcony.
One of the episodes of the film that was shocking to me was...
Mike, want to take the mic?
One of the episodes in the film that was shocking to me was the incident where 100 women were beaten by protesters and the police stood by idly. I would have thought that the beating of middle and upper middle class and perhaps upper class women would have been a really galvanizing event nationally if it had been covered by newspapers, but apparently that was not the case. Did that ever occur to you? And if so, why did it not have more of an impact?
Well, Paula, you talked about using race and class privilege. Why don't you start with that, and then I'll follow up with the reaction, because it did help.
Well, and I think that one of the things that I found the most interesting was that, and not specifically about the DC parade, but some of the use of public space and the organizing, the protesting in public space that happens specifically in New York is that when they get attacked by other people, they actually call the police, and in some cases tried to get police escorts and police protection for some of their public organizing in the spaces that they knew they were going to get attacked. But it's true, the police did not always protect them. And I think this is, for me, this is representative, I mean, and this was true also for African American women who were protesting in public space, and those were very sedate and respectable protests that African American women were involved in, primarily because of racism and ideas about black women in public spaces. So they really they had to kind of mobilize an opposite appearance than white upper and middle class women had to. But the police didn't protect sort of either of those groups. And I think this is, to Susan's earlier point, about a really strong patriarchy, essentially, right? A really strong belief in what did women who stepped out of line deserve.
But I think we also have to give Alice Paul credit. She was the one who organized that march. And I don't think she said he was delighted with how it turned out, because you can't be delighted that these mobs of men are beating up women. But it does really play into her hands, and she runs with it. She's able to force the city of Washington, D.C. to hold public hearings, or maybe it's the House of Representatives that does, that really call out the police on this. And she's pushing just those same buttons. She's saying these are women, white women, and they are not getting the protection that they should have. And then she ups the ante even more so when women are jailed and are thrown into terrible conditions. And then she's able to use that to build sympathy for the cause, because after all, the reason they are put in jail and sometimes given 6-month sentences is really just for blocking a sidewalk or disturbing traffic. And the disconnect between the severity of those sentences and what they actually were jailed for, she can again turn and use to her effect. And that's where the militancy really helps to build support. It also turns people off. It scared a lot of mainstream suffragists. They just thought that having these women, you know, in front of the White House during wartime, this is just going to scare people away from the movement. So there's a lot of that back and forth going on. But going back to where we started all of this, I think both sides, it really helped the movement.
No? Okay. And
The right.
where do we have some questions back here?
I have a question for all of you. Say if you were all on Congress and you're in the middle of passing an amendment, what would you like say or do to like get it through or succeed?
Yeah. That's a tough one. It's kind of
This is why I don't run for office.
It's a big, it's a big complicated one. Gosh, I think we've heard so many arguments that were made. They were the arguments from it being better for the home, being better for women being able to manage their families better, in addition to the more philosophical argument of it being a right of citizenship and being a function of democracy. You know, all of those arguments were made across the board and appealed to different members of the Senate and the Congress to say, well, maybe this is something that we need to consider.
And the multiple arguments, too, I will say, what's happening kind of on the ground. I'm thinking about recruitment strategies that that sort of the suffrage leaders made when they were working with diverse groups locally. So we're at poor and working class women, African American women, immigrant men. They made very different arguments that sometimes, you know, maybe they didn't fully believe, but they were attempting to kind of recruit.
Yeah, I mean, it was politics. You know, you speak to your constituency and you speak to the thing that you think will get those people interested for whatever their own interests represent. Not just one thing. Yeah.
I also hope that if I were there, it's hard to imagine me in the Senate or something like that, but that I would sort of say to people, why is it that women don't have the vote? Look at all the things women do. And we can sort of flip it sort of in a different way, and I sometimes think about this. Think about women not having the vote. And I think about this because my very first feminist demonstration was in 1970 on August 26th, which was the 50th anniversary of the vote. And I sometimes think, you know, gee, only 50 years ago, women didn't have the vote, and that just seems wrong. And I think there's a way in which if we try and articulate it in that way and talk about the justice of it and link it to real people's lives, that it somehow becomes more real. And it also makes us realize that the alternative of women not having the vote, we don't want to go there. No.
We have one question over here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you each for your wonderful work as well. I have a question about putting it in perspective in the broad sense. When you talk about, I thought it was wonderful, you talked about this great opportunity, which I agree with, which is wonderful, that the 100th affords us to look at the history and learn the history that we didn't grow up with. It was just not there, and this centennial gives us that opportunity to try to fill that in and inspire us, hopefully, to vote, you know, to use that as an inspiration, right? So one of the things you were mentioning about how things had changed by you got into the teens and how women now were working, more women were working of all classes, and women were going to school in greater numbers than they had back in the middle 1800s, let's say. And I think about the progress we've had today, where the world has changed dramatically. You know, the number of women in professional schools, the number of women working is extremely high. yet we still do fight for equal pay. You know, there are these themes that still, this thread that goes through all of it, where we've made such enormous progress in many areas and sort of so technically, and yet we're dealing with the Me Too movement, which thank goodness is coming out. So we're learning about it, but it's sort of like the progress on the one hand, and yet the same discussions on the other. I'm even thinking about how Susan B. Anthony had to stop wearing bloomers because she was ridiculed for her dress. And today, how politicians and women have to deal with what they're wearing and how they're looking and so forth. And it seems to be getting better, and yet so many of these issues and what's appropriate just keep coming round and round. So I'm wondering where you're seeing our next 100 years, let's say, and how we might be able to work on some of those issues that keep coming back.
Well, I'm not planning to be around for the next 100 years, but I think having immersed myself in the suffrage movement and the history of it recently, I really do have a much stronger sense of the continuum of women's activism. And even though part of me thinks, why are we still having to protest all of this? Yet there has been change, and we will never get to that point where it's perfect or things are equal. And I think the suffragists knew that. Susan B. Anthony knew that. She had taken it as far as she could go, and she was willing to pass it along to rising generations. And so I see both my work as a historian, my work as a feminist, where we are now, where we are going, as part of this larger movement that will always be necessary. And sometimes I get discouraged, but a lot of the times I'm just really proud to be part of this larger story.
Yeah, I just want to make a little brief comment, and then I think we have time for one more after this. No more. We're done? That was last one. You might have the last comment. I just want to, just in line with what you're asking, some of the research that I've done has been on women in non-Western countries, in Japan and Ottoman Turkey and India. And when I look at the struggles that women have had in other places, we look pretty good. And so not to say that we don't have a lot of work to do, but I think in some respects we're very lucky in this country, and we're very lucky for the opportunities that we have to argue and to protest and to work hard to get the changes that we would like to see made, and which we do. And it's not this way for women in a lot of other places. So I think we're out of time. I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for participating with all of your wonderful questions and giving us an opportunity to talk more about the issues that have come up through the video, and certainly to thank all of the people at the EMKI who have put together this really quite wonderful video and opportunity that will go on for several months.
Yes, thank you so much, Roberta, Susan, Karen. What a wonderful conversation we've had. Thanks again to our sponsors and our supporters, all of you for being here. We do have coffee and cookies right in the front lobby, so don't run away. We can continue the conversation out there. And just a little plug for all of you for next week on January 30th, we have a program called For Our Nation's Founders and Today's Political Challenges, which is a special program in partnership with Mass Historical Society. So thank you all for coming here this evening, and thanks again to our panel. Thank you.